Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Ricardo, for that. It's a real pleasure for me to be here to discuss with you and kind of, I think what I would like to do is we had a really rich discussion this morning with the case studies from Senegal, from Angola and from Timor-Leste. And I think I'd like to just pull some themes together, both using those examples and some from around the world around different types of sovereign wealth funds. And we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of mandates which you would have seen and heard this morning, because we had heard from three very different sovereign wealth funds. We'll talk a little bit about governance and governance standards, and we'll talk a little bit about stakeholder management, and that I think is going to be a really important part of this presentation. So the first thing I want to just set out is, what is a sovereign wealth fund? And I think it's really important that to point out that this is the standard definition of a sovereign wealth fund. A sovereign wealth fund is a special purpose investment fund or arrangement that is owned by the general government, created by the general government for macroeconomic purposes. Sovereign wealth funds hold, manage or administer assets to achieve financial objectives and employ a set of investment strategies that include, in this definition, which was written in 2008, investing in foreign financial assets. This is the definition that we use, and it was written by our members, our 26 founding members, in 2008. But since the mid-2000s, and over that time, and since kind of the last decade and a half, there has been a real evolution of best practice around the legal structures and mandates of sovereign wealth funds. And so the definition is now really changing, depending on whether you invest at home, abroad, or a mixture of the two. So there are different types of sovereign wealth fund, as you would have heard this morning, and they are incredibly diverse. There is no standard model of a sovereign wealth funds, and there are three main types and a hybrid. The first is the traditional savings fund, which save natural resource revenues or foreign exchange reserves for diversification, and for some you've got pension reserves. So if I pull up a few examples there, natural resource revenue savings is a kind of standard oil fund that we know about. If you look to Asia, you will see a group of funds, whether that's from China, from Singapore or Korea, that invest in the long term in foreign financial assets to diversify the foreign exchange reserves. And pension reserve funds that do go into the general government, but they are generally there to fund future pension liabilities from the government. And the second type of sovereign wealth funds are stabilization funds. Now, we don't see these terribly much anymore. They are quite an old-fashioned type of fund, but they are there for the central bank to use to stabilize exchange rates, particularly in a resource-dependent economy, and also to smooth government spendings across the commodity cycle. The third type, which is the newer form of sovereign wealth funds, is the strategic sovereign wealth fund, or a strategic investment fund, or a sovereign development fund, however you want to call them. They're all pretty much the same thing. And these can be formed for, as I've got here, for four reasons. The first is stewarding state-owned enterprises to create national and regional champions. And this is very much based on the model kind of pioneered by Temasek in Singapore from 1974 and Khazanah National in Malaysia from 1994. And essentially that works as a state-owned private equity fund. The government bequeaths its stakes in its state-owned enterprises to the fund. The fund then seeks to improve the management of those companies, improve their performance, and then eventually work to list some of that company whilst maintaining a strategic stake. The second type of strategic fund is to enhance local stock market liquidity. This is not a particularly common type of sovereign wealth fund, but you do see funds in the Middle East and in Africa looking to invest in local IPOs, in local funds, to really kind of deepen local financial markets. They can also be used to promote economic development, as we were hearing from Fundos this morning, and really looking at strategic sectors that are going to have a real impact on economic development and diversification for current and future generations of citizens. And the final type of strategic fund is attracting long-term foreign direct investment, either as a promoter or a partner. And again, this is something that Fundos does really well, but there's something that is becoming an increasingly common form of sovereign wealth fund, particularly on this continent. However, there are many funds out there that do a little bit of one or two of these things, these three different types of main forms. And this is a perfectly normal way of sovereign wealth funds thinking about how they do business, having a domestic portfolio and a foreign portfolio. However, I was at a conference for African sovereign wealth funds only 2 weeks ago in Washington, DC, and we were having a real discussion on this topic of hybrid funds. And it came out from a lot of your peers across the continent that a sovereign wealth fund is not a panacea. It can't solve every issue in a domestic economy. And really, we were saying that lawmakers need to decide what the most appropriate role for a sovereign wealth fund is, and not to spread that mandate too thinly across the economy, because it doesn't really achieve anything properly. It's much more impactful to do one or two things really well than to try and do a lot of things quite well. So the really important thing about when you're thinking about which of these types of mandates do you choose is considering which mandate is going to be relevant to the country, which is going to be most relevant. For many developing countries, it's worth considering that investing, and I mean investing, not spending, in the present, may also be the best way to invest in future generations. Talking to Babacar at lunch, we were talking that Senegal has an average age of 19. And that new generation, those future generations are coming in this continent really fast. So that's a really important kind of thing to think about when considering which mandate is most appropriate. Also, ensuring the relevant and alignment with the country's economic goals also makes stakeholder education and buy-in much easier, because you can understand why a country has a sovereign wealth fund, and when a new government comes in, you don't spend a lot of time re-educating a new executive every time. Where the link between the sovereign wealth fund and the national economy is less obvious, the fund runs the risk of being poorly managed because nobody knows what it's there for. It could be shut down or repurposed or raided by politicians looking to use it for another purpose. And this relevance to the country's present and future is also key to its legitimacy, as it enables stakeholders to understand the fund's role and benefits to them, their families, their community, and their country. This is harder for savings funds, but communication and really clear communication to stakeholders is key, and we'll come back to that later. So just a point, as I've been saying, that what a sovereign wealth fund was in the mid-2000s is no longer really what a sovereign wealth fund is today. As you can see in this slide, the changing composition of sovereign wealth funds over time. So we start with Kuwait, which is a stabilization fund, savings fund, which was formed in 1953. And we go up to the most recent ones, which were formed in 2021 in Mauritius, in Armenia, and various other countries. Whereas they were initially savings funds, and you can see that from the different colours, more and more sovereign wealth funds are now being formed for strategic or development purposes. It could be argued that as communication technology expands, this need to be more relevant is becoming more important, because as people can discuss and have more forums on social media, then you really need to make sure that this relevance, and I think that this kind of importance is really shown in this chart, this need to have direct relevance to the people and your stakeholders. So I'm going to go on to a little bit about my organisation and what we do, and hopefully this will make you will understand why I'm relevant. my husband probably thinks I'm not relevant, but we can be relevant here. So the IFSWF, the International Forum of Sovereign Wealth Funds, was the first organisation created by and for sovereign wealth funds to set standards of governance, to facilitate networking, and to represent the sovereign wealth fund community as a whole. Our history starts back in November 2007, when on the back of a huge build-up in foreign exchange reserves around the world, the IMF convened a roundtable of sovereign wealth funds and reserve managers in Washington to really facilitate the exchange of ideas. Eventually, and you can see this on this slide, and I'm sure they'll be shared, that ended up in the creation of the Santiago Principles, the 24th generally accepted principles and practices for sovereign wealth fund governance in October 2008. Since then, as an institution, we've grown. We started off with 26 members. We currently have 46 from across the globe. As you can see, we're a pretty diverse and global bunch. We are run out of London as an independent not-for-profit company owned by our members. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Santiago Principles. All our members voluntarily apply the Santiago Principles, and they are the accepted gold standard for sovereign wealth fund governance, investment practice, and risk management. They are increasingly being used by counterparties to, where they're looking at, does my counterparty, if you're a sovereign wealth fund, apply all relevant standards. The only relevant standards to sovereign wealth funds are the Santiago Principles. They've also started becoming somewhat written into law, so in the new Trans-Pacific Partnership between the Trade Partnership, actually the definition of a sovereign wealth fund is an institution that implements the Santiago Principles. They are split into 3 pillars. The first is objectives and coordination with economic policy. The second is the institutional framework and governance structure. And the third is around processes and practices around investment and risk management. All our members use the Santiago Principles to benchmark their practices and structure, serve as a framework for peer learning, and continuously improve investment and financial outcomes. What I will say is the Santiago Principles, you can Google them, have a look at them online. They are very broad, and we were really criticised for them being broad when they were first written in 2008. And they were said to be pretty toothless. To be honest, what's really happened, because they're broad, is that we've able to really make them relevant to a much wider range of institutions, which has not only enabled us to really drive the improvements of governance and transparency across the entire sovereign wealth fund community, but also really help educate as well and bring up best practices. Santiago Principles are totally voluntary. However, we do run a triennial self-assessment process, and I'm right in the middle of doing one now, where we ask all our members to go through the principles one by one and explain how they implement them. And that is really not about judging whether it's right, wrong, good or bad. It's more about providing disclosure around how those basic principles and practices are implemented at an individual institution. And I think it's really important to note that that varies entirely from country to country, to fund. What might suit the Alaska Permanent Fund in America is not going to suit the fund in Mozambique, and it's not going to suit a fund in Kazakhstan either. So it has to be, we really have an awareness that every institution is unique. If I am going to distill the Santiago Principles down, we've got 4 main kind of the way that I see them. This is kind of a personal distillation, and I think there will be other people with different expertise that will see them slightly differently. But the first and the most important, which is why I've put it at the top, is independent management of a sovereign wealth fund. The operational management of the sovereign wealth fund should, and this is quoting directly from the Santiago Principles, should have the authority to implement its strategies independently. The management should set their own investment policy. That is not set by the stakeholders. The stakeholders set the mandate, but the investment policy should be set by the operational management. And that enables investment decisions to be protected from undue and direct political interference and influence. The management should also act in the best interest of the sovereign wealth fund. The second kind of key message from the Santiago principles is that where it's necessary, so particularly in a resource fund, that there are clear deposit and withdrawal rules. The sovereign wealth fund's founding legislation must have clear and precise rules about deposits and withdrawals, how often, how much, and the circumstances under which those spending and savings rule, that money is put in and taken out. And I know that we'll hear more from Alexis on this, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Andrew later as well. There should be clear objectives for the funds, and the founding legislation should clearly state its purpose. I can't underline strongly enough how important clarity and precise drafting of legislation is in all of these issues, but particularly in the purpose. You know, it should really have a very, very clear purpose. And finally, transparency. It is incredibly important because the ultimate owners of a sovereign wealth fund are the citizens of the country, and they have a right to know how their money is being managed. And I know that we often are quite, as someone who's a communications person, people can be quite sniffy about communications. You know, they can be quite pejorative, but good communications around a sovereign wealth fund enable stakeholders to understand the fund, its mandate, its investment strategy, and that enables it to build trust with the citizens. And that also includes things like full internal and external auditing and monitoring, and clear and informative external reporting, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. So I'm just going to show a few examples, to go through those three pillars of the Santiago principles and how they are implemented. There we go. Right. So it's worth noticing, and I'm going to underline this head up before I start talking about this, that best practices in the sovereign wealth funds legal structures have evolved as the world has changed. We're no longer in 2008, and it's really important that we don't put sovereign wealth funds in aspic and, you know, kind of freeze them at a moment in time and say that this is best practice. What is best practice in the 90s or the 2000s or the 2010s may not be best practice today. And I think there are two real primary influences, and this hopefully will answer some of the conversation we were having this morning over what legal basis is the right one in a particular set of circumstances. And I think the first for that is the political context. Is there a strong legislative body? Do they need to have more oversight over the fund? Or is the power more centralised in the executive? This is kind of really important to how you think about where the ultimate accountability lies for a fund. Now, these types of funds, these four here, these come from an analysis of I think 36 members from around the world, 36 sovereign wealth funds. So the first, we were discussing this morning, is the Presidential Ministry or Sovereign Decree, and that's very much a kind of an oil fund from the Arabian Gulf region. Often that's how they're founded. You could have an act of a legislative body, which is in democracies or with parliamentary systems. That is how those funds would be founded, or laws related to fiscal and budgetary matters or management of natural resources. And again, this is kind of one of those models that is becoming less popular because it doesn't provide as much oversight and accountability because it goes to the budget rather than as a distinct legal entity. And finally, you've got an institution established under local company law. That is a very useful, tool. But it's often which of these you choose is not only predicated on the political environment, but also on the mandate of the fund. So, for example, a sovereign wealth fund with an intergenerational savings or stabilisation mandate is usually established as either by a decree or an act, or a decree or an act, because that's the more usual way. Although Singapore's GIC, which is a foreign exchange reserves fund, is a company under local law and that manages its assets for a client. So it doesn't own its asset, the central bank does. However, a sovereign wealth fund that invests at home and is looking to attract co-investors is a better structure is a company under local law, because commercial actors understand the legal basis of that institution and how to act with it. In short, it allows the fund to speak the same commercial language as their partners. But whatever the legal basis of the sovereign wealth fund, the key is that the legislation is clear, that it is exact, and that the issues have not been compromised to ensure that the legislation is passed. We've been working with a central bank where they've had a compromise in the legislation for their fund, and it's causing all sorts of headaches, whether that's for audit, consolidation of balance sheet, domination of currency. So I think that clarity is really important, because if it is unclear, it will lead to suboptimal outcomes. So I'm very briefly going to look at, This is a really important question as well. So although this kind of line on a balance sheet without independent legal personality has been used in the past, it is very much frowned upon, I think, now as particularly in the post-COVID environment, that it's too easy for governments to draw down on, and you lose your intergenerational equity. So we would always advise that you have an independent legal entity as a sovereign wealth fund. It makes the governance, which is what I'm going to come on to next, so much easier. So I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, because I think Richard will talk about it more later. But this is the kind of basic governance structure. Whichever legal structure you use, this is a kind of model. It will change and vary depending on the circumstances. But regardless of the legal basis of the fund, there are a few basics that need to be put in place to ensure that a sovereign wealth fund has the right function and proper division of responsibilities. This isn't the only way of doing things. For example, in Ghana, they have a civil society board that also has oversight, as well as a board of directors. And I think we'll address this a little bit more later, but it's important to really think about that governance structure and the division of responsibilities and accountability. So I'm going to look a little bit at some case studies now about different sovereign wealth funds. This is a stylized organisation chart for the very famous government pension fund Global, and it is often held up as an exemplar. I think there are two things I would really bring up with this model, and it's really worth thinking about. The first is that you can see by this diagram that it's actually really complex. And it should be noted that the Finance Ministry funds a captive asset manager, so Norges Bank Investment Management, that's only job is to manage the fund. And this is a relatively costly strategy. We were talking about capacity building earlier. You need a lot of capacity to implement this model successfully. You need a lot of financial expertise. And you have to, and in terms of investing in capital, in international capital markets. The other issue with this, and this is a very widely made point, is that the Parliament sets the investment policy and the asset allocation. And the challenges with this is that members of Parliament, lawmakers, are not on the whole financial professionals and are not always able to make the best decisions. And this goes back to my point around making sure that you have independent management of the fund. MPs instead are really best placed to hold management accountable to fulfilling their own investment policy that meets the mandate that is set out in the legislation by Parliament. The next model I just want to briefly look at is the Kuwait Investment Authority. This is another fund that is accountable to Parliament, and I think it's probably one of the hardest parliaments to make happy. But essentially, we all think of the Kuwaiti fund as having this very long-term savings portfolio, but it also manages a stabilisation for a more liquid general reserve fund, and that provides money to the general budget. So 85% of the future generation fund, which once that 10% of oil revenues is gone into there, it cannot come out again. And that is 85% managed by external asset managers and 15% managed by professionals employed by the Kuwait Investment Authority. And that external management is a really interesting way of making sure that you get good outcomes by professionals without necessarily having to build your own capacity in-house. KIA does employ, however, 400 people, and many of them are on civil service salaries. Another model, just so that you've got a little flavour of the different types, and I have chosen oil funds for all of these to keep them relevant, is the State Oil Fund of the Republic of Azerbaijan. And this is primarily a stabilisation fund, so 85% of its portfolio are in really liquid money market assets and fixed income, so in bonds. But it does provide, as you can see in this diagram, an important source of financing for strategic investment projects in Azerbaijan. It should be noted, though, and I think it's a really important distinction to make, is that those projects are extra budgetary spending. They are not designed to turn a financial profit. They're there to invest in the country over the long term. So they are not part of SOFAS's portfolio, and they are there as development projects rather than as for financial gain. Finally, in terms of looking at some models, is the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority. And this happens to be one of my favourite models. NSIA has 3 distinct ring-fenced funds, each with its own mandate. As you can see, there's a savings fund, a future generations fund, a stabilisation fund, and an infrastructure fund. They are all distinctive, they are all distinct, they are ring-fenced, they all have their own teams, as each mandate to execute requires a different skill set. Money can't flow between them, and can be allocated to individual funds depending on national priorities. So at the moment, most of Nigeria's funding is going into the infrastructure fund rather than into the other 2. And interestingly, this infrastructure fund is not just investing in hard infrastructure like the Niger Bridge. It's also really playing a role in creating financial infrastructure. So it's set up a guarantee company. We were talking earlier about using sovereign wealth funds or not to guarantee lending. What the Nigerians have done in this case is they've set up a fully owned company to play that role. They've also set up a mortgage guarantee company. And all sorts of other of these kind of basic building blocks of financial markets which didn't previously exist, but they've set those up as independent institutions rather than taking on the function of that themselves, because that is not where their skill sets lies. So my final section today is on reporting and stakeholder management. So as I mentioned earlier, it is essential, and I underline that, to the legitimacy and accountability of any sovereign wealth fund, that its stakeholders, both its government, so its parliament, and its country's citizens, need to know and understand what the fund does, and that it does it well. This requires publishing not just data, like audited financial statements. I mean, I don't know about you, but most people in the UK, for example, aren't accountants and don't necessarily know what those mean. But we also need to publish information which explains to the audience what those statements mean and the relevance to their lives. And there are several tools that can help a sovereign wealth fund communicate with their stakeholders and ensure they are seen as legitimate. So I've got a few examples. You have an integrated report, which is, in this case, is the New Zealand Superannuation Fund. It's a New Zealand Superannuation Fund's report. It's done to GRI reporting standards. And then you've got Temasek underneath that. And those reports really not only look at the financial reporting, but also how they are impacting on the economy, how they're thinking about sustainability, etc. There's a general annual report, and you can also do as well some form of, we were talking a little bit about ESG earlier, either an economic impact report or a responsible investment reports. There are lots of different terms, but what these talk about is the non-financial benefits that accrue from the sovereign wealth fund. And this last slide just underlines what I have just been saying. The challenge with communication, the challenge with getting buy-in from people is not it's not just about providing lots of information and hoping that people read it. It's about providing better information. It's about providing information where your people are communicating and getting it at the right level. Financial reporting, usually IFRS are the general standards that most sovereign wealth funds use, is key and essential, as is internal and external audit. But non-financial reporting can also have a really important role in creating legitimacy and better decision making. Because if you have a good framework for thinking about how you're going to report and account to your stakeholders, then you end up making better decisions. So we've recently, and this is I think a good story to end on, we've recently received an inquiry from a new sovereign wealth fund which didn't know what standards to report to. Were they those required by the owner or those required by its operational manager? The subsequent conversation uncovered the problems of the underlying legislation and that the government had intentionally made the language of the founding legislation unclear to ensure that it got passed. But the problem for that is that nobody knows how they want to account for it and what is the appropriate way of making decisions for that fund. So I think it's really important to really underline that reporting is not just outward, it can also have a really important way of helping the management think about how they make decisions. It also helps clarify the messaging externally. So in short, it improves performance and enhances legitimacy. So I think I'm going to stop there. I could have said a whole lot more, but I will leave it at that point. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to take any questions you might have.